For weeks, the world has been locked onto a single narrow strip of water, warships inching through it, drones circling above it, analysts debating who controls it. 21 miles wide at its tightest point, the Strait of Hormuz became the center of everything. Global oil, global tension, global fear. Cameras followed every destroyer. Headlines tracked every warning. The assumption was simple. Whoever controls that choke point controls the world's energy supply. But while all of that, attention was fixed on warships and blockades, something else happened. Quietly, almost invisibly. No explosions, no press conferences, no dramatic escalation. Just a single announcement on April 12, 2026, that should have dominated every headline on the planet, but didn't, because it didn't look like power. It didn't look like strategy. It didn't even look like a response to war. It was a pipeline, and not a new one. A 45-year-old piece of infrastructure. Built decades ago for a scenario most people assumed would never fully happen. Suddenly became the most important asset in the global energy system. In one move, Saudi Arabia didn't try to fight over the Strait of Hormuz. It didn't try to control it. It didn't even try to root in it. Instead, it did something far more disruptive. It started making the strait irrelevant. And if that sounds like an overstatement, it isn't. Because the question now isn't just whether oil can keep flowing. It's whether the entire balance of power around one of the world's most strategic choke points has quietly shifted, and whether the United States, Iran, and the rest of the world are only just realizing it. Hi, I'm Susan, and what we're going to do today is break down exactly what just happened, step by step, using verifiable data and on-the-ground developments to understand why this move is being described by energy analysts as one of the most strategic infrastructure plays in modern history. Because on the surface, it looks simple. A pipeline ramps up, oil keeps moving, crisis partially contained. But underneath that surface is something much bigger. This isn't just about keeping exports flowing during a conflict. It's about how a country spent decades preparing for a moment like this, and then executed that plan faster than almost anyone expected when the moment finally arrived. To really understand why this changes the equation, we have to go back to the very beginning of the current crisis. Before the announcements, before the repairs, before the sudden surge in westbound oil flows, to the moment when everything that the global energy system depended on was thrown into question almost overnight. And that moment starts with Iran. It started on February the 28th, 2026, when coordinated strikes by the United States and Israel hit targets inside Iran. For a few hours, the world watched the immediate fallout. Damage, assessments, satellite images, official statements. But the real shock didn't come from the strikes themselves. It came from what Iran did next. Because, within hours before the smoke had even settled, Iran reached for the one lever it knew could send shockwaves through every economy on the planet: the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, normally carries around 20 million barrels of oil every single day, roughly 1/5 of global supply. It is the single most important energy corridor on Earth, and almost overnight, traffic through it collapsed. What had been a constant stream of roughly 150 ships per day dropped to just 4 or 5. A 97% reduction, practically instantaneous. Tankers stopped entering. Insurance costs surged. Shipping companies froze. And just like that, the global energy system lost its most critical artery. The impact was immediate and impossible to ignore. Oil prices surged toward $120 a barrel. Prices climbed sharply across major economies. In Asia, factoring costs began rising as energy inputs became unpredictable. In Europe, already dealing with fragile energy stability, the pressure intensified. Governments that had built their economic planning on the assumption that Hormuz would always remain open suddenly found themselves scrambling for alternatives that didn't exist, at least not at scale, because that was the underlying problem. The modern global energy system wasn't designed with redundancy at this level. It was designed around efficiency, around predictable flows, around the idea that certain routes, like Hormuz, were too critical to ever fully close. And now, that assumption had been shattered in a matter of hours. Which raises a question that becomes more urgent the deeper you look at it. If the world depended so heavily on a single choke point, why wasn't there a serious backup plan already in place? The answer is, for most countries, there wasn't. But for one country, there was. And not just a rough contingency or a theoretical alternative buried in policy papers. A physical, operational, fully built system designed specifically for this exact scenario. One that had been sitting in the background for decades, largely ignored because it wasn't needed. To understand that system, you have to go back more than 40 years to a different conflict in the same region. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, oil tankers moving through the Gulf became targets. Missiles, mines, direct attacks. The so-called tanker war made it clear that shipping oil through the Strait of Hormuz was not just economically important, but inherently vulnerable. And Saudi Arabia, watching that unfold in real time, came to a conclusion that would shape its strategy for decades. If your entire economy depends on a route you don't fully control, then you don't actually control your own future. So they decided to build a way out. Not a temporary fix, not a short-term workaround, a permanent alternative. A pipeline that would stretch across the entire Arabian Peninsula, from the oil-rich eastern fields near the Persian Gulf all the way to the Red Sea on the western coast. Over 200 kilometers of steel, cutting through desert, connecting Abqaiq to Yanbu, creating a completely separate export route that bypassed the Strait of Hormuz entirely. It was called the East-West Pipeline, Petroline, and at the time, it looked like an expensive insurance policy against a worst-case scenario that might never fully materialize. Decades passed, the global economy stabilized, Hormuz remained open, tankers kept moving, and that pipeline faded into the background, maintained, upgraded, but rarely discussed in global headlines. But here's the part that matters now. Saudi Arabia never forgot why it built it. While the rest of the world optimized for efficiency, assuming stability would hold, Saudi Arabia kept investing in resilience. It expanded capacity. It maintained the infrastructure. It planned for scenarios most policymakers preferred not to think about. So when February 28, 2026 happened, when Hormuz effectively shut down, and the global system started to strain under the pressure, Saudi Arabia wasn't starting from zero. It wasn't scrambling to design a solution. It already had one. The only question was how quickly it could bring that solution online at scale, and whether it would be enough to matter in a crisis this large. And the answer came faster than almost anyone expected. Within hours of the first strikes on February 28th, Saudi Arabia began activating a contingency plan that had been sitting in the background for decades. Not in theory, not in stages, immediately. Oil that would normally flow east toward the Persian Gulf and out through the Strait of Hormuz was directed west, across the desert, toward the Red Sea. The East-West Pipeline, the same one built during the tanker wars of the 1980s, suddenly became the primary artery for Saudi exports. What had been a backup route, an insurance policy, was now carrying the weight of a global crisis. At first, the shift looked modest from the outside. A gradual increase in westbound shipments, a rise in activity at the Red Sea port of Yanbu. But behind the scenes, something much more significant was happening. Saudi engineers, operators, and logistics teams were executing a transition that had clearly been rehearsed long before this moment arrived. Flow rates were ramping up, systems were being pushed toward their upper limits, tanker traffic was being redirected and rescheduled, and within days it became clear that this wasn't just a temporary adjustment. It was a full-scale pivot. Saudi Arabia was no longer relying on Hormuz at all for a large portion of its soup point. It had effectively stepped outside the choke point, but there was a catch, and it was a big one. The pipeline, as originally designed, could carry around 5 million barrels of oil per day. Impressive by any standard, but nowhere near enough to compensate for a disruption of roughly 20 million barrels, moving through Hormuz under normal conditions. Even at full capacity, it could only offset a fraction of the loss, which brings us to the part of the story that turns this from a smart contingency into something far more strategic. Because Saudi Arabia didn't just activate the pipeline, it had already found a way to expand it. In the years leading up to this crisis, Saudi Arabia quietly worked on a complex engineering solution that most people outside the energy sector barely noticed. Parallel pipelines, originally built to carry natural gas liquids, things like ethane, propane, and butane, were modified so they could also transport crude oil if needed. This wasn't a simple switch. It required reconfiguring flow systems, adjusting pressure dynamics, and ensuring that materials designed for one type of hydrocarbon could safely handle another at scale. It was expensive, technically demanding, and easy to overlook in peacetime. But in a crisis, it changed everything, because when those converted lines were brought online alongside the original Petroline, the pipeline's total capacity didn't stay at 5 million barrels per day. It jumped to approximately 7 million. 2 million additional barrels every single day, moving westward across Saudi Arabia without touching the Strait of Hormuz. And the timeline is what makes this even more remarkable. By March 11th, just 11 days after the conflict began, the expanded system was operating at full capacity. 11 days to transform a dormant backup into one of the most critical pieces of energy infrastructure on the planet. That's the moment when the broader significance started to come into focus, because this wasn't just about maintaining Saudi exports anymore. This was about stabilizing a portion of the global oil supply at a time when the primary route had effectively collapsed. Every barrel moving through that pipeline was a barrel that didn't need to pass through contested waters. Every shipment leaving Yanbu was one less point of leverage for Iran to control, and while 7 million barrels per day couldn't fully replace Hormuz, it was enough to fundamentally change the trajectory of the crisis. It bought time. It reduced pressure. It proved that the global energy system, while fragile, wasn't completely without alternatives. And that realization that Saudi Arabia had just activated a system capable of bypassing one of the world's most important choke points marked the first real turning point in how this crisis would unfold. Because from that moment forward, the question wasn't just whether oil could keep flowing. It was how far this workaround could be pushed and how long it could hold under pressure. If you're following this breakdown and want to stay ahead of how these shifts are reshaping global power in real time, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next takes this from a smart workaround to a direct confrontation. And it didn't take long for that pressure to arrive, because Iran was watching all of this unfold in real time, and it understood exactly what was happening. The strategy behind closing the Strait of Hormuz was never just about disruption. It was about leverage. Control the choke point and you control the pace of the global economy. But every barrel that Saudi Arabia pushed through the East-West pipeline was a direct challenge to that leverage. It meant fewer tankers in the Gulf, fewer opportunities to apply pressure, fewer ways to turn geography into power. And from Iran's perspective, that pipeline wasn't just infrastructure anymore, it was a threat. So the response came not at sea, but on land. In early April, strikes hit multiple energy-related targets across Saudi Arabia, including a critical pumping station along the pipeline network. The impact was immediate and measurable. Throughput dropped by roughly 700,000 barrels per day, gone almost instantly from the system. One strike, one facility, and a significant portion of the bypass capacity was reduced. It was a clear signal delivered without ambiguity. If the Strait of Hormuz couldn't be the point of control, then the alternative routes would become targets instead. The battlefield was expanding beyond narrow waterways into the infrastructure that made those waterways optional in the first place. For a moment, it looked like the vulnerability had been exposed, because pipelines, unlike fleets, don't maneuver. They can't reposition. They are fixed, visible, and if you know where to look, predictable. The very thing that made the East-West pipeline powerful, its ability to bypass Hormuz, also made it a single, concentrated point of failure. And the question hanging over everything was immediate. Had Iran just found the pressure point that could neutralize Saudi Arabia's entire strategy? But what happened next shifted the narrative again. On April 12th, just days after the strike, Saudi Arabia announced that full pumping capacity had been restored. Not partially, not gradually, fully. Back to approximately 7 million barrels per day, the same level the system had reached before the Humla. And the speed of that recovery is what turned this from a story about vulnerability into a story about preparation. Because infrastructure doesn't normally come back online that quickly after a tent-treated strike, especially not at this scale. Repairs of that magnitude typically take weeks, sometimes months, depending on damage, logistics, and access to specialized equipment. But in this case, the response was almost immediate, which tells you something critical. This wasn't improvised. Spare parts had been pre-positioned. Repair teams were ready. Emergency protocols had been designed, tested, and rehearsed, left before the first missile ever hit. Saudi Arabia hadn't just planned to use this pipeline in a crisis. It had planned for the possibility that the pipeline itself would be attacked during that crisis. And that level of foresight changes how you interpret everything that came before it. The activation wasn't reactive. The expansion wasn't opportunistic. Even the recovery wasn't surprising, at least not from inside the system. What looked from the outside like a rapid response was in reality the execution of a scenario that had already been thought through in detail. A pipeline built in the 1980s, expanded quietly over the years, pushed to full capacity in under 2 weeks, hit by a strike, and then fully restored within days. That sequence doesn't happen by accident. By April 12th, while headlines were still focused on naval movements and diplomatic breakdowns, Saudi Arabia had quietly re-established the full strength of its workaround. 7 million barrels per day flowing westward again, away from the Strait of Hormuz, away from the immediate reach of maritime disruption. The message wasn't delivered through speeches or statements. It was delivered through flow rates. The system was still running, and more importantly, it was proving that it could take a hit and keep going. But to really understand how powerful that is and where its limits begin, you have to look closely at the numbers. Because 7 million barrels per day sounds massive, and it is. But in the context of what the Strait of Hormuz normally handles, it tells a more complicated story. Before this crisis, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and refined products moved through that narrow waterway every single day. That's the baseline the global economy was built around. So even with Saudi Arabia pushing its pipeline to maximum capacity, you're still looking at only about a third of what's been taken offline. It's not a replacement, it's a buffer, a critical one, but still a partial solution. And Saudi Arabia isn't the only country trying to work around the choke point. The United Arab Emirates has its own bypass route, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, often called ADCOP, which runs from inland fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz. Under normal conditions, it carries around 1.5 million barrels per day with the ability to push closer to 1.8 million if needed. In this crisis, that capacity has become just as important. Combined with Saudi Arabia's 7 million, you get something approaching 9 million barrels per day of crude that can bypass Hormuz entirely. But even that combined effort doesn't close the gap. Not even close. There are still millions of barrels with nowhere to go, especially from countries like Iraq and Kuwait, which remain almost completely dependent on the strait. Iraq has discussed building alternative pipelines for years, routes through Jordan or Turkey, but those projects never moved beyond planning stages. Kuwait faces a similar reality. Its course, roughly 2.5 million barrels per day, still rely almost entirely on Hormuz. So while Saudi Arabia and the UAE have managed to create partial escape routes, large portions of the region are still effectively trapped behind a choke point that isn't funding. And then there's another layer to this that doesn't get nearly enough attention because it's less dramatic than missiles or naval standoffs, but just as important. Moving oil across a country is one challenge. Getting it onto ships and out to global markets is another. And this is where the system starts to strain in a different way because all of that westbound crude flowing through the east-west pipeline ends up in one place, the Red Sea port of Yanbu. A port that until was never designed to handle this level of volume as a primary export hub. Since the crisis began, activity at Yanbu has surged to levels that would have seemed unrealistic just a month ago. Tanker loadings have jumped to roughly 4 times their normal rate. Infrastructure that was built for steady, predictable flows is now operating under constant pressure. Berths are occupied almost continuously. Scheduling windows are compressed. Every piece of equipment, from loading arms to tugboats, is being pushed to its operational limits. And offshore, fleets of massive tankers, very large crude carriers capable of holding up to 2 million barrels each, are lining up, waiting for their turn to dock. Here's the critical detail. Even though the pipeline can now deliver up to 7 million barrels per day to the Red Sea coast, the port itself hasn't fully caught up to that capacity. In late March, actual loaded exports were closer to 4 to 5 million barrels per day. That gap between what the pipeline can supply and what the port can ship creates a bottleneck, one that shifts the pressure from the Strait of Hormuz to the infrastructure on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. In other words, Saudi Arabia solved one constraint and immediately ran into another. But this isn't a surprise to them. Just like the pipeline itself, this bottleneck was always part of the equation. You can build a route around a choke point, but unless every link in that chain can handle the volume, the system won't operate at full strength. And right now, Yanbu is that limiting factor. Not because it's failing, but because it's being asked to do far more than it was originally designed for. The question isn't whether it can keep up indefinitely, it's how quickly it can evolve to match the scale of what the pipeline is now delivering. And that's where the story begins to shift again. Because if there's one pattern that's become clear throughout this entire situation, it's that Saudi Arabia doesn't just react to bottlenecks, it plans for what comes after them. And that's exactly where the next phase is already beginning to take shape. Because, for Saudi Arabia, the East-West pipeline was never meant to be the final solution. It was the foundation. What we're seeing now is the early stage of something much bigger, a deliberate effort to redesign how energy moves across the region so that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer the central artery it once was. And that shift isn't theoretical anymore. It's happening in real time, inside Saudi planning circles. Discussions are already underway about expanding the pipeline beyond its 7 million barrel per day capacity. Not just incremental upgrades, but structural expansion, new lines, additional pumping capacity, and potentially entirely new routes that would further increase the volume of oil that can move westward. At the same time, attention is turning to the Red Sea coast itself. Yanbu is being pushed to its limits, and that pressure is accelerating conversations about building additional export terminals, some of them tied to projects that, until recently, had nothing to do with oil at all. One of those is NEOM, the massive development project on Saudi Arabia's northwest coast that was originally envisioned as a futuristic hub for technology, tourism, and sustainable living. Now, in the middle of an energy crisis, it's being discussed as a potential node in a new export network. That alone tells you how quickly priorities can shift when the underlying system is under stress. Infrastructure that was designed for one purpose is being reconsidered for another, all in an effort to increase flexibility and reduce dependence on a single vulnerable route. And Saudi Arabia isn't acting alone. The United Arab Emirates is reportedly exploring the possibility of building a second pipeline to expand its own bypass capacity to Fujairah. Regional conversations are intensifying around multi-country corridors that could connect oil and gas flows across borders, linking the Gulf to the Mediterranean and eventually to Europe, without requiring passage through Hormuz at all. What used to exist as isolated national projects is starting to look more like a coordinated regional architecture. At the center of that vision is something that, until recently, lived mostly in policy discussions. The India-Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, often referred to as IMEC, first announced at the G20 summit in 2023. It was initially framed as a long-term connectivity project, ports, railways, digital links. But in the context of this crisis, it's taking on a new dimension because embedded within that concept is the possibility of integrated energy routes, pipelines, and shipping networks that would move resources from the Gulf across Saudi Arabia, through Jordan or Israel, into the Mediterranean and onward to European markets. A complete rerouting of energy flows built not around a single choke point, but around a distributed system of alternatives. And that brings us to what might be the most important shift of all. Not in infrastructure, but in mindset. For years, these kinds of projects were treated as hypotheticals, interesting on paper, useful in theory, but ultimately unnecessary because the existing system, encored by the Strait of Hormuz, was functioning well enough. Why spend tens of billions of dollars building redundancy for a scenario that might never happen? Now that scenario is no longer hypothetical, it's operational. The Strait isn't functioning normally. The risks are real. The costs of inaction are visible in energy prices, in supply, disruptions, in geopolitical tension. And suddenly the same projects that once struggled to gain traction are being reevaluated with urgency. Funding conversations are accelerating. Political alignment is shifting. Timelines that once stretched decades into the future are being pulled forward. There's a phrase that's been circulating among analysts watching this unfold: the shift from hypothetical to operational reality. It sounds simple, but it captures exactly what's happening. The world is no longer asking whether alternative energy routes are worth building. It's realizing they may be necessary for stability. And Saudi Arabia, by activating a system it built decades ago, has effectively forced that realization into the present. If you're seeing how this is evolving beyond a single pipeline into a complete redesign of global energy flow, that's exactly the point. Because what comes next shows why even this massive shift still doesn't solve everything. But even with all of that momentum, all of those plans, and all of that capacity being pushed to its limits, there are still gaps, serious ones, that no pipeline can easily solve. Because not all energy moves the same way. Crude oil can be redirected, rerouted, pushed through steel arteries across deserts if the infrastructure exists. But liquefied natural gas, LNG, is a completely different system. And right now, that system is under just as much strain. Unlike crude, LNG depends on a chain that's far more rigid. It has to be liquefied at specialized facilities, shipped in highly specific tankers, and then regasified at its destination. You can't simply redirect it through a pipeline that wasn't built for it. And that's where the current crisis reveals another layer of vulnerability. Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, has already seen significant disruption to its capacity after strikes damaged key infrastructure. Portions of its output, critical, not just for Asia, but for Europe, are offline with estimates suggesting recovery could take months, not days or weeks. And there is no equivalent to Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline waiting in the background to compensate. So, while the crude oil side of the crisis has found at least a partial workaround, the LNG side remains exposed. And that matters, because for many countries, especially in Europe and parts of Asia, natural gas isn't just another fuel. It's a primary source of electricity, heating, and industrial energy. You can stabilize oil markets and still face an energy crisis if gas supplies remain constrained. It's a parallel pressure point running alongside everything else, one that infrastructure alone can't quickly resolve. And even on the crude side, the workaround introduces new vulnerabilities, because once oil reaches the Red Sea, it still has to pass through another choke point to reach global markets, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of that sea. It's wider than Hormuz, less constrained geographically, but still strategically sensitive. Increased traffic through that route means increased exposure, insurance costs rise, naval presence becomes more important, and the possibility, however remote, of that corridor becoming contested adds another layer of uncertainty to an already fragile system. In other words, bypassing one choke point doesn't eliminate risk, it redistributes it. The pressure moves, the map changes, but the underlying challenge, moving massive volumes of energy through a world that is suddenly far less stable, remains. And that's before you even consider what Saudi Arabia has had to give up to make this strategy work as effectively as it has, because that expansion from 5 to 7 million barrels per day didn't come for free. It required converting pipelines that were originally designed for natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butane, into crude oil carriers. Those liquids aren't just byproducts, they're critical feedstocks for the petrochemical industry, the very sector Saudi Arabia has been investing in as part of its long-term plan to diversify its economy beyond raw oil. Facilities that rely on those inputs, industrial complexes, manufacturing chains, downstream projects tied to Vision 2030, are now operating with reduced supply. So in a very real sense, Saudi Arabia is trading part of its future for stability in the present. It's redirecting resources away from long-term economic transformation and toward immediate crisis management. That doesn't make the decision wrong. In fact, in the context of a global energy shock, it may be the only viable choice. But it does add a layer of complexity that often gets overlooked. This isn't just a story about strategic brilliance. It's also a story about trade-offs. A pipeline that protects exports today may slow diversification tomorrow. Infrastructure that stabilizes global markets may strain domestic industrial plans. And those trade-offs don't disappear when the crisis ends. They carry forward into whatever comes next, which brings us to the final piece of this puzzle. And it's one that challenges a very common assumption about how quickly things can return to normal. Even if the Strait of Hormuz were to reopen tomorrow, fully safely, with guarantees from every side involved, the system wouldn't just snap back to normal. That's the assumption a lot of people make, and it sounds logical on the surface. Remove the blockage, restore the flow, but that's not how global shipping actually works, especially not under conditions like these. Because what's been disrupted here isn't just a route, it's confidence. Tanker operators, insurers, logistics planners, they don't move based on announcements, they move based on risk calculations. And right now, even in a best-case scenario, that risk doesn't disappear overnight. Mines have to be cleared, security has to be verified, insurance premiums have to come down to sustainable levels, crews have to be willing to re-enter a zone that just weeks earlier had become one of the most dangerous waterways on the planet. That process takes time, not days, months. Which means, even in the most optimistic timeline, oil flows through Hormuz wouldn't return to pre-crisis levels until well into the summer. And during that entire period, the global system would still be leaning heavily on alternatives, on pipelines, on rerouted shipping lanes, on infrastructure that was never meant to carry this much of the load for this Lanuskang. The East-West pipeline doesn't stop being important when the strait reopens. In many ways, it becomes even more important because it provides stability during the transition back to whatever the new normal looks like. And that leads to a realization that sits at the center of everything we've just walked through. This crisis didn't just expose a vulnerability, it changed how power is defined in this region. For decades, control of the Strait of Hormuz was seen as one of the most powerful strategic positions in the world. If you could threaten that choke point, you could influence global markets, pressure, government, shape outcomes far beyond the region itself. That logic still holds, but it's no longer the only game being played. Because what Saudi Arabia has demonstrated quietly, methodically, and at exactly the right moment is that there's another way to approach that equation. Instead of fighting for control over the choke point, you reduce your dependence on it. You invest in alternatives. You build systems that give you options when others have none. And when a crisis hits, you don't need to win control of the bottleneck. You just need to make it less relevant. That's the shift. The United States responded to the crisis with military positioning, projecting force into the strait. Iran responded by leveraging geography, using the choke point as a pressure mechanism. Saudi Arabia responded with infrastructure, something slower, less visible, but ultimately more durable. 3 different strategies, all playing out at the same time. But only one of them changes the rules of the game itself. Because if enough oil can move without touching Hormuz, then control over Hormuz doesn't carry the same weight it once did. If enough alternative routes are built, pipelines, corridors, ports, then the global energy system becomes less concentrated, less fragile, less dependent on a single point of failure. That doesn't eliminate risk, but it redistributes it in a way that's harder for any one actor to dominate. And that's why what happened on April 12th matters so much. Not because a pipeline came back online. That's the headline, but because of what that pipeline represents. 45 years of planning activated in less than 2 weeks, expanded capacity that most people didn't even realize existed, a rapid repair that proved the system could withstand attack and keep operating, and a signal to the rest of the world that the era of relying on a single choke point may be coming to an end. Saudi Arabia didn't open the Strait of Hormuz in the traditional sense. It did something far more strategic. It showed that the world might not need it as much as it once did. And in a system where leverage is built on dependency, that might be the most powerful move of all.